genealogy. And as part of that, I do a lot of military research. So I research at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I do research at the National Archives in St. Louis and various other spots around the country. So in that capacity, I use military records, civilian records, government records on a regular basis. So when we talk about Spirit of St. Louis, when we talk about the St. Louis Archives and the National Personnel Records Center, it is just one cog in the wheel of the National Archives system. So I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes about how the National Archives retains and collects records and how St. Louis fits into that overall National Archives organization. So the National Archives is what's called NARA. So it's the National Archives and Records Administration. And within that, I'm going to move my little bobbing head out of the way for those of you who it might be blocking the screen. So the National Archives has over 25 regional campuses across the United States. Now that number has changed slightly because they've closed a couple of archives facilities. They have closed the National Archives in New York City, and they have moved all of those records to Philadelphia. At the moment, the Chicago Archives is still open and still accessible to people. It's tenuous. We don't know if that collection is going to be closed and moved, but at the moment, it's still open and available. The archives has three what I would call hub facilities. So this is where the bulk of the records are housed. There's Archives 1 in Washington, D.C., which is the one we are all familiar with. That's where the Declaration of Independence is. That's where the Constitution resides. This is the bulk of military records from pre-revolution all the way up to 1914. So if I'm looking for Revolutionary War records, if I'm looking for Civil War records, Spanish-American War records, this is where I'm going to go for those records collections. Then there's what's called Archives 2, which is in College Park, Maryland. And Archives 2 has modern military records. So it would include things about First World War, Second World War, forward, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf Wars. For the First World War, this would include overseas records. So this would be things like the AEF, the American Expeditionary Forces. This would be people who were stationed in the Canal Zone. Those records are at Archives 2. Now, if I'm looking at personnel, like unit records for the First World War for troops who are stateside. So you're doing basic training at Camp Dodge or at Fort Meade. Those records are at Archives 1. It's just the overseas records that are at Archives 2. But when we get into the Second World War, forward, Korea, Vietnam, all the records, all the unit records, all of those kind of administrative records outside of personnel records are in College Park. Now, what the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis houses are those personnel records from the First World War to present. So things like if you're, a Navy yeoman, your individual personnel file, right? What you did in the Navy is going to be in St. Louis. Or if you had somebody who was a civilian personnel that worked for the federal government. You had a family member that worked for the post office, or you had families who worked for like the National Park Service. Those records are housed at NPRC in St. Louis. So kind of those everyday, I took 3 days of vacation, I passed my typing test, right? Those types of records are what are in St. Louis. So the government kind of splits those military records up into pre-1914, right? So those are the ones that are in Archives 1 in Washington, D.C., and those ones that are post-1914, which are split between those various locations. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. So those three hubs are where the bulk of those records are. But then at these individual regional archives are military records and civilian records as well. So things like individual camps and bases, those records are in the individual archives where they reside. So for example, Fort Sheridan, Great Lakes Naval Base, Camp Butler down in St. Louis or in Springfield. those day to day, we're running the camps, right? The gatehouses, the weather temps, the employees who are hired to work in the mess hall. Those records are at whichever regional archive they happen to be in. So if it's Camp Meade, right, that's in Maryland, those records are going to be in the Eastern Regional Archival Hub. If they're stationed out in California, those regional records hubs in San Francisco would have those records. So there are still some things that are kind of scattered about, but for the bulk of what we're doing and for what we're going to talk about today, those are the three main hubs. So when I go to the National Archives website and I want to kind of search to figure out what types of records are available and where am I going to find them, when you go to their page, so if you go to archives.gov, it's going to take you to a page that looks just like this. And you'll see there are two places. The first place you're going to search is Veteran Service Records. So if I'm looking for records, I can click on that link and it's going to tell me what's accessible to the public. But the link next to it, and I'm not going to show you a slide of it, but I want to mention it, and I'm going to mention it a little later on when I talk about certain records collections. The National Archives has been working nonstop since 2020 to digitize records, and instead of parsing them out to third-party sources like Ancestry or Fold3, they're digitizing those records and embedding them directly into their own card catalog. So when I talk later on about things like morning reports or after action reports, sick reports, stuff like that, they're embedding those directly into the National Archives catalog. And I'll talk a little bit about how to search for those as well. So that's an extra bonus that you're going to hear about as well. So when I click on that link for military records, it brings me to a page that gives me the opportunity to request records digitally. So according to the federal government, next of kin is unremarried widow, child, sibling, or parent. So if it is your grandfather's records, you're not next of kin. But if it's your dad, or if it's your brother, or if it's, your child, you can request these records from the National Archives, and you can do it directly online through their eVetRec system, which is just electronic veterans records. If you are not next of kin, you still would have access to some of these records as long as they are before today's date, 1964. And I'll explain that in a little more detail in just a couple of minutes. So you can put in a request and you can go to St. Louis and view these records. You could go to the National Archives and view these records at College Park too. So you just can't request them electronically if you're not next of kin. And if any of you have requested records from eVetRecs before, what they used to do was you would fill out the form on the website. It would tell you to print out a signature page. You would sign your name and you would mail it back to the National Archives in St. Louis. That process has changed. Since the beginning of the year, they're using what's called ID Me, which if you've ever applied for a government job or if you've ever had a government contract or grant, ID Me is what they use for the federal government to keep track of contractors and employees. So it's very involved and it's a pain in the derriere. Because what you have to do is you have to take a photo of yourself. You have to take a photo of your driver's license. There's other things that you have to click on to verify that you're a real person and that you are who you say you are. Unless you have a camera on your computer, it doesn't really work very well. So you kind of have to do it from your phone, and the lighting has to be a certain way and your camera has to be a certain distance from you to get like a passport, to get your head in this perfect little box so they can upload it and prove that you are who you say you are. So while it's convoluted and it's difficult to get set up, once it's set up, you can request other documents from them and they already have their information. So it's a change, not necessarily for the better, but it's as a way to make requesting records more efficient. Hopefully, we'll see. So if you're going to go in person, if you're not next of kin, or if you just want to look at the records yourself, if you just want to hold them in your hands and not have a digitized copy, then you can request records directly through the NPRC. So there's an email address that you can contact. So that is listed here. So STLARR, that's short for St. Louis, Archives and Records. So that's what that stands for. You would send them a request telling them that you would like to view a series of documents. And I'm going to show you two forms that are what you would typically use if you're going to request these types of documents. So I'll walk you through that in a couple of minutes. When they respond back to you saying they've received your request, they will not allow you to schedule an appointment until they have found the records that you've requested. So you'll either get an email saying that, yes, we have your records available for you, and you can go to Eventbrite and schedule your appointment. Or they'll tell you, we're sorry, we couldn't find the following records, and they'll send you an email telling you which records could not be located. If a record is too fragile for you to access, what they'll do is they'll digitize that record and they will send you a link, and you'll have 30 days to download that document. You'll have access to it indefinitely, but you have to download it from that site within 30 days. So I've had this happen where I've sent an email request. They allow you to request up to 10 documents at a time. So I submitted my 10 documents. 8 of them were able to be located. One of them, they sent me an email saying we could not find this record. And then the 10th one was, this is too fragile. Here's the link to download the file. So you might get a mix of those when you contact them. So when they contact you and say, yes, we have your records, please go to Eventbrite. That's what they use to schedule their appointments. So when you go to Eventbrite, you're going to look for the National Archives. There are 2 types of requests from the NPRC. The first one is textual records. That's what these are. You want to look at these original textual records. The other is for their microfilm collections. Microfilm collections, you can book a time slot and you can go down anytime you want because there's no records that need to be pulled in order to access the microfilm. With the textual records, they have to pull them. So if you know you're going to be going down, they've emailed you and said, yes, we have your textual records. Please fill out your time slot. And you book that. If you are interested in looking at microfilm as well, you have to book a time slot for that. So you have to choose that day and request that as well. You can't just put in your request for a textual appointment and then just wander over to the microfilm department. You have to make sure that you book an appointment for both. They'll send you an email for the textual records for a PowerPoint that you need to watch before you go. And once you've watched that PowerPoint, it'll give you a short little test that you will take about how to handle archival records and what they allow and what they don't allow. If you pass that test, everybody passes that test. If you pass that test, then it prints a certificate for you and then sends a notice to the archive staff that you've, taken the PowerPoint, you've done the quiz, and you're ready to go. So when you arrive, then they could make your photo ID for you. So they'll take your picture, they'll give you an archival research number, and that number is good for 1 calendar year. If you didn't take the test in advance, then they would sit you down at a computer, you'd take the 10 minutes to read through the PowerPoint slides, take the quiz, and then they would take your photo ID. There are 2 ways that you can access and copy documents when you were there. You can use the self-service photocopy machine if you would like. So if it's not a fragile document, it'd be 25 cents per page. If it is a fragile document that they need to copy for you, if you want it photocopied, that could be 80 cents. It depends on the size of the paper that they have to use. You can bring a scanner. So you can bring your own equipment. You can bring a flatbed scanner. You can bring your phone. You can bring an LED camera and take your own photos. That is perfectly acceptable and encouraged instead of using the photocopy machines in the archival center. Anything you bring in with you. If you bring in your own loose papers, they have to be stamped that they've been viewed before you leave. And what they do is they will examine them at the desk before you check out. They'll put them in a locked bag. They'll give you that locked bag. You'll walk out into the reception area. You'll hand them the bag outside of the archival center. They'll unlock it and then hand you your materials. So it's better if you can avoid bringing more than a sheet or 2 of paper. Bring your laptop, bring your iPad, bring whatever you want that you need that's electronic to keep notes. But they truly frown upon you bringing in loose papers just because they don't want to run the risk of documents being stolen or damaged or missing. So let's talk first about civilian records. I mentioned those a little earlier, so I'm going to show you a couple of slides on the types of civilian records that they have, and then the bulk of the rest of our time is going to be spent talking about military records. So as I had mentioned, the NPRC houses those civilian employee records. Now, these are sampled, so they don't have every civilian employee who's ever worked for the federal government, but they do have samples of civilian records. So they have some postmaster records, not all postmaster records. They have some, like I said, National Park Service records, but not all. Census takers, things like that. They have those kinds of records. So the best thing you can do is request those records on the form that I am going to talk about in a little bit. Worse that they come back and say, I'm sorry, these were sampled. We don't have records for your particular family member or ancestor. It doesn't hurt to try and see what they have access to. So if you are looking for civilian records that were for somebody who left government service before 1952, you can request those records. Sometimes they're redacted. Usually only the unredacted files are available to the person who worked for the government. If you could show that person's deceased and that you are a legal agent, you're a family member, then you can usually get access to those unredacted files. If it's after 1952, we do not have access to those. So only the person whose civilian employee records that they belong to have access to those records. So even if that person is deceased but left the government's employ after 1952, we don't have access to those. But the types of records that are included in here would be CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps employees. It would also include people who worked for the government under the Works Progress Administration, whether that was a farm assistance program or like the photographers that took photos during the war. There were a lot of people who worked for the literary agency, that went into archives and museums and documented what was within their collections, went into courthouses and documented the records that courthouses had. So those types of employee records are still available through NPRC. If you're looking for a CCC record, it's form number 14136. And if you're looking for Works Progress Administration, those records are, form 14137. At the end of your handout, there's the link to both of those. So if you're looking to request these types of records, I've already put the links in the handout for you. You'll just click on that link, download that form. It's a fillable PDF. You'll put your information in, and then you can send that request to the archives email that I gave you a few minutes ago. Here's an example. So my grandma worked for Army Purchasing at Navy Pier during the Second World War. And I was probably the only person that had looked at her employment file since she left the military in 1946. And while there wasn't a lot of genealogical detail in there, there were some fun little nuggets of information that were within her personnel file. So she had to take the civil service exam. She actually had top marks. She had a near perfect score on her civil service exam. So she really had her pick of any assignment that she would have liked because she was in the top 2% in her test class. She chose to stay at home. She chose to stay in Chicago. And all of her like vacation requests, every month there'd be like a little report about what her employee, how good of an employee was she for that month. Her efficiency ratings, right? So they test you on how fast you can type. They test you on a variety of different things. So here's an example of her efficiency rating, in her typing skills. So they're just kind of fun. Her industry, right, was just a check. She was adequate, but you can see she had really high marks for attention to detail and cooperativeness. If you knew my grandmother, you would raise an eyebrow at the cooperativeness part because she was never cooperative. Dependability, so it kind of tells you what kind of character the person has. And what I loved most was there was a letter in her file stating that she was going to be resigning from civil service as of August 9th, 1946. Now that's after my grandfather came home. My grandfather came home March 9th. And the fun thing is that when I saw this letter in her file, it says she, is discontinuing her work because she wants to maintain a home. She was 5 months pregnant with my dad at this point. My grandpa came home and exactly 40 weeks later, my dad was born. December 26th of that same year. So by the time she's giving her resignation, she would have known that she was expecting, and she was resigning her position at Navy purchasing. So that was a cool little piece of family history that I was able to include. Those are the kinds of things that you would find in those files. Now, my grandfather, before the Second World War, he was a yeoman in the Navy during the Second World War. But in the 1930s, he had served in the Civilian Conservation Corps. He and two of his brothers had served. Now, the family legend was that my grandpa Casey was too young to join the CCC. You had to be 18, and he was only 16. So he enlisted because it was just like joining the military. You went through a boot camp, you lived in barracks, just like the military would. Um, so he lied and said he was my Uncle Joe. And then when he became 18, he re-upped and re-enlisted. But at this point, he was old enough to enlist under his own name. So in those earliest records, he signs up and says that he's his brother, Joseph Tatara. And what I love about these records, because I have two, actually I have three. So I have three records. I have two for Joseph, one for my grandpa as Joseph, and one for my real Uncle Joe. And then the third one is my grandpa Casey enlisting in the CCC as himself. And how did I prove that story? Because the first Joseph was 131 pounds and, was like 5 feet 2 inches tall. And then the second Joseph was 5'7.5" and was like 158 pounds. And then one had brown hair and brown eyes, which is my real Uncle Joe, and my grandpa, who has blonde hair and blue eyes. Your eyes and your hair color doesn't change. So I could prove that story was correct by looking at both sets of CCC records for Joseph. And then my grandpa, when he enlists as Casey, right, when he enlists under his own name, again, blonde hair, blue eyes, 5'2.5". And, he gained weight. He was about 8 pounds heavier than he was 2 years previously. But everything else in that record tracked. And then within that CCC file, so if you had somebody in your family who worked for the CCC, it gives you the date they enlist, it gives you where they do their training, it tells you where they were sent to do their service, and they might have done stints in more than one location. And it'll tell you where those locations were, how long were they stationed at each location? Did they receive any kind of special training while they were there, right? Did they learn how to work electronics? Did they learn how to fight forest fires? It's going to tell you all of that information. And then it's going to give you their discharge date, and it's going to tell you whether they were discharged in good standing or not. In my grandpa's file, there's a note that he had gone AWOL for 24 hours, and he was investigated, right? They did a hearing, and it turns out his excuse was the reason he was AWOL for 24 hours was because his camp in Washington State was far from town, and he had missed the last bus back to camp and had to walk from town all the way back to the camp and walked all through the night until he got back the following morning. So you find some interesting stories in these records. So this is my Uncle Joe, my true Uncle Joe. These are records talking about him helping to build the highway through Michigan. And these records are accessible, so you can request those. So let's talk about military records for the remainder of our time. So a lot of people think instantly, I can't get any Army or Navy records because there was a fire at the National Archives. Yes, absolutely. There was a fire at the National Archives in 1973 that destroyed about 78 to 80% of Army and Army Air Corps records from that 1914 date up until 1960. So Navy records, Marine records, and Merchant Marine records were untouched because Merchant Marine records were kept in a separate place. But when the fire happened, Navy records and Marine records were kept in a separate location. So those are 100%. Those were untouched in the fire. But it is true that Army and Army Air Corps records were largely destroyed during this time. And it wasn't necessarily because of the flames. It was the, thousands and thousands of tons of water that they poured into the building to put that fire out. So the vast majority of records were burned from the water damage to put the fire out versus the actual fire. So the good news for us is that the records that could be saved were rehoused and set aside until they could be recreated at a later date. So when you're looking at NPRC records, sometimes you'll see B listed, which is a burn file, versus R, which is a recreated file. I'll talk about that more in just a second. But they're using all kinds of modern technology to try to scan and pull out as much detail from these damaged records as they can. And if they can't regenerate any of the writing off of those original records, then they're kind of going around and collecting records from third-party sources to kind of fill in those gaps. So if you've ever gotten a letter back from the National Archives saying this is a fire record, tell us everything you know. I shrugged the first time I got that letter, and I was like, that's why I'm asking you. I wouldn't be asking if I had that information. But they ask for things like, where were they discharged? Do you know what unit they were in? Do you remember or know what base or camp they were stationed at during their military service? And then they go around and they look for those various records. We can do that too. So instead of waiting for the National Archives to do this, we can go to College Park and look at those unit records, right? We can go to National Archives 1 and look at World War I stateside records in Adjutant General's records collections. So we can kind of do a little bit of this research all on our own, but that's the point of them sending this letter, is to kind of figure out where else can we go to recreate some of these military records. So if you get a letter back saying these are fire records, there's usually just going to be 3 pieces of information that's within that file. It's going to be their service record. It's going to be that placard that has their name, their birth date, their unit, and their number, their military number, their ID number. It's if they were in the hospital for any reason, there's going to be a hospital card record, and it's not going to tell you what they were in the hospital with or for, but it's going to give you a category. So it might say something like lower body injury or, stomach issues, but they're not going to tell you ulcers or gastritis, right? They're not going to give you the specific. They're just going to kind of give you a general body location. And then their final payment voucher. And the final payment voucher could be useful, or it could be a wild goose chase, because when the military would discharge people, they didn't always discharge them directly out of their unit. So at the end of the First World War and at the end of the Second World War, if you were coming into Camp Grant or you were coming into Great Lakes, sometimes you were discharged in what were called discharge units, meaning that they would break those guys up into 1,000 men discharge units and discharge them all in bulk, in mass. So they could have served in the 313th Engineers, but they get to Camp Grant and everybody's there at the same time. And they just say, okay, we're discharging you with these other 1,000 guys. And now you're going to be in the 2nd discharge detachment or the 3rd discharge detachment. So if you see that, you know that that's not the unit that they served. That's just the unit that they put them in so they could get them out of the service. Also, if you see somebody listed in a casual unit, that doesn't mean they came home in Hawaiian shirts and khakis. It means that they came home injured, that they had returned to the U.S. or were discharged from the military outside of their unit, either because they were in the hospital or they were convalescing in another location. And they'll be in what's called a casual unit, meaning that they're being discharged with other men from that same hospital or other men from that same triage facility outside of their normal military unit. So if you get one of those records and you see either of those things, detachment or casual, you know that there's other places you're going to have to look to figure out exactly what unit they had served during the war. Like I said, Coast Guard and Merchant Marine records were not held by the National Archives at the time of the fire. Merchant Marine records have just been transferred over to the NPRC. They had been housed in different locations. Same thing with Coast Guard. These records were housed at the National Archives in Washington and have been moved over recently to be joined with these other collections. So let's talk about what types of things the National Personnel Records Center has. So they have those military personnel files. They're called OMPFs, the official military personnel file. They also have burial case files. These are only for First World War because when you're dealing with deaths during the Second World War, those are called IDPFs or individual deceased persons files, and each one collected different things. They have court-martial records here. So if you know, like my grandpa Casey in the CCC, right, going AWOL, there was a hearing. Same thing with the military. If somebody was brought up for court-martial, there would be a hearing, there'd be testimony, and there'd be an official verdict. I'll show you an example of one of those in a couple of minutes. Those records are at NPRC. The index for those records is at College Park, but the records themselves are at NPRC. Those morning reports that I talked about that are on microfilm, those muster rolls, those monthly after action reports, sick reports, all of those are on microfilm. You don't need a textual appointment. You can make an appointment to look at the microfilm, but they have been digitizing and making these accessible through the National Archives catalog. So if you have the last name of the service person and you have their military ID number, you can put those into the National Archives catalog directly, and it's going to bring up any results where that name and that service number appear. So yes, you could go and look at the microfilm if you're already planning to go to St. Louis. Otherwise, you can look directly through the National Archives catalog at home for these 3 records collections. So let's talk about OMPFs. Again, if you submitted a request to St. Louis and you got a record back saying that your record was destroyed in the fire, this is the record that was destroyed in the file. It's that OMPF, that official military personnel record. So if they were in the Army or Army Air Corps during the First and Second World War, those records were largely impacted by this. Now, what was not impacted are the unit records. So if you get back a letter saying that, like my Angus MacDonald had served in the 46th CAC, which is the Coastal Artillery Corps during the First World War, his personnel file was destroyed. All I had were those 2 pieces of information. I went to College Park. I looked because he went overseas as part of the AEF during the First World War. I was able to find and pull his unit records. So I was able to pull the records for the 46th CAC. And sure enough, Angus was listed in those records. So I was able to confirm that he was a supply sergeant, eventually promoted to sergeant. Like all of those administrative records were there, even though his personnel file was destroyed. If you get one that has not been destroyed, especially Navy or Marines, they're going to include information about their service, not their unit, but just their service. So where they were stationed, what dates they were in the service, their enlistment date, their discharge date. It's going to include any schooling that they've done. So if they took rifleman classes, if they took electronics classes, any type of schooling that they received is going to be included in there. If they're transferred from one unit to another. So if they're in the 313th Engineers and that unit joins with, the 316th, there's going to be a note in their file that they were transferred to another unit. It's going to include any promotions or decorations earned, if they've earned any medals. So typically you'll see a record in there that says that they received their Good Conduct Medal, that they received their ribbons for their place of service. So Second World War, if they were in the Atlantic Theater or the Pacific Theater, they would get different ribbons for that. All of that would be included in their file. Now, the way the government works versus census, right, which is 72 years, for military records, it's a 62-year rolling calendar. So if somebody left the service 62 years from today's date, so if they were discharged before July 1st, 1964, then those records are accessible to the public. So you can request them and go down to St. Louis and view them. Again, if you're not next of kin, you can't apply for them electronically. But if you are next of kin, you can apply right through EvetRecs. You can, request those records and have them sent to you. I always recommend going and seeing them if you have the opportunity, because you get to see fronts and backs. You get to see the whole file as it was put together. Sometimes there's a lead or there's something that doesn't come out well in a scan that could be a clue that helps you in your research if you can go down and view them in person. If you're going to be requesting these records, you can fill out form, 13173. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. Or you can reach out to the National Archives in St. Louis and ask for the form, and they can send it to you to fill out. When you do these forms, they come in two sections. So the left-hand side of this form is for military records. The right-hand side of this form is for civilian service. So if I were requesting my grandmother's service records, civilian service records, I'd fill out that right-hand side. So I would put her name at the top, but then instead of marking branch of service and rank and service number on the left, I'd fill out the civilian side. What agency did she work for? What were the dates? Did she work for more than one agency or at more than one location? And you would put those in the record. If I'm looking for military service records, it's going to be on the left-hand side. So for example, at the top, I put my name. So that's the requester information. So I would put my last name, first name. I'd put my email address and my phone number. And then just below that box at the top is where I would put the name of the service person that I'm looking for. So last name, first name, middle initial. If you have it, a full middle name, please put it in. We think names are unique in that there can't possibly be two Casimir Tataras. In my grandfather's case, there were. So my grandfather's name is Casimir Joseph Tatara, not Casimir. There's no I in his name. It's just Casmer. There were two Casimir Tataras that served in the Second World War. It blew my mind. My grandfather from Chicago, and then another Casimir Tatara from Connecticut. So because I just assumed there was only one Casimir and I didn't put his middle name in, I got the wrong record. I had to reapply and get the other record. So put the full name in if you have it. If you have their service number or their social security number, please put that in there. And then date and place of birth. It could be Illinois, it could be Massachusetts, but if you could be specific, especially if it's a common name, if you can say, Mount Prospect versus Illinois or Chicago, right? As specific as you can be. If you know their branch of service, please choose it. If you don't know whether they were enlisted or if they were an officer, that's fine. You can check unknown. But then under other identifying information, if you have their parents' names or if you know where they were stationed or what the unit was, or if you have some other kind of information that can be helpful, like, Angus was gassed in France, right? Anything. Put it down on that list because it helps them distinguish your person from somebody else with the same name. And I talk about my Angus, right? Angus Leroy MacDonald. There were 3 Angus Leroy MacDonalds that served in the First World War. So it took a while to find my Angus. Leroy's not a common name. Sure enough, there were 3 of them. So you fill out that form and you send it to the National Archives. Like I said, you could do up to 10. So it takes a while for them to go through those, pull the records and make them available to you, but then they'll send you a message letting you know. Now, if it's somebody that you're researching, or if you're lucky enough to have somebody who's considered a celebrity or who's considered famous in your family, there's a series of records that are called PEP files. They're people of exceptional prominence, where they've already pulled those records out and they've already digitized them, and they already appear in the National Archives catalog. So, people like Ronald Reagan, anybody who had served, John F. Kennedy's records, Jackie Robinson's records. Those records are already pulled and they're already accessible through the National Archives website. So you just click on that link, you have it in your handout, and you'd be able to kind of peruse that list to see what records are available. So I do a lot of research, First World War research, just as an aside. And I was researching the Chemical Warfare Service, the CWS, because baseball players, Christy Mathewson, Ty Cobb, and Branch Rickey were all in this unit. And in the PEP files, Christy Mathewson was there and Branch Rickey was there, but Ty Cobb wasn't. So I was able to request Ty Cobb's original military service record. It was so cool because I got to actually hold it in my hand. So some people you think should be in there and they aren't, which is kind of suspect. Here's an example of a Navy record. Navy records are really robust. There's usually a photo of the sailor in these records. There's usually fingerprints and, like a little outline of a body where they'll mark any tattoos or identifying features. And it has every port of call. So you could see this one for Hugh Craig. It tells me every place where the USS Alabama docked, tells me when he was in training. He started at Great Lakes um, Naval Base. He was stationed on board the USS Alabama, eventually was discharged out of St. Louis, and it gives all of those dates, all of those ports of call. And then what he did while he was in the Navy, right? So it's going to have his it's funny because there's things in there like their beer and Coke card, right? So they had a punch card every month and they could stamp like the top was for Coca-Colas and the bottoms were for beer and they would stamp them. Like you can even find those kinds of things in these records. So they're pretty detailed. They would include insurance policies. They would include change of addresses. They would include information about next of kin. So in this particular record for Hugh, it tells me that in his enlistment papers, he listed his father, Andrew Craig, as his next of kin. While Hugh Craig was in the service, his dad moved. So his original address was written in blue in Emporia, Kansas. They lined through it and wrote that he was living in Kansas City, that he was living in Argentine in Kansas City. So they crossed it out and put the new addresses in. I knew he had moved. I knew they had moved to Kansas City. This pretty much gave me a really nice narrow timeline on when that occurred. And then on his insurance, when he gets married, it lists his wife, right? So it tells me Hugh's wife is Mrs. Edith Hazel, basically when they got married, what his birthday is, where he was born, where they're living, his dates of service, his serial number at the top, that 383-103, that's his service number. So there's a lot of information that's available if you're lucky enough that somebody served in the Navy or in the Marines. Here's one of those final payment vouchers that I talked about. So his cousin, so Hugh's cousin, John Craig, had been discharged out of the 2nd Company Discharge Detachment. Again, that's not the unit that he served in during the war. That was just once he arrived at Camp Grant. All of these guys were being discharged in mass, 1,000 at a time, and he was in the 2nd Discharge Detachment. So it took a while for me to find his real unit. So I had to go to the Archives 1 and kind of dig through those records. But, you know, if you're lucky enough, it'll say who it is. So another one of their cousins, Donald Wright, had served in the Second World War. He was a prisoner of war. So in his OMPF file, there are the telegrams and the letters back and forth alerting his mother that he was missing in action and that he was captured. There are other records in there. There's a postcard in there from the American Red Cross with just his signature on it that she received 3 years later, letting her know that he was still alive because there'd been no contact for 3 years because I think he was being held in Stalag 4 is where he was being housed. But you could see these were in the fire, right? They're charred. They have burn marks in them. So this was a fire record, a burn record that I had access to. Now they will not let you access these records. They digitize them now and they email them to you. They do not let you handle these personally anymore. So I did get lucky. But there's an amazing amount of information that are in these records. So I showed you a First World War example. Here's a Second World War example of the types of things that you can find within these collections. And if you had somebody who was a POW, the POW records collections through the National Archives are housed at Archives 2. So there's an index to those that's available through the National Archives website in the AAD. So you can go in, you could choose World War II, and there's a collection for POWs, and you can search that. And if you can find your soldier or sailor listed in the POW index, you can submit a reference slip like this to the National Archives 2 in College Park. You would have to go there to look at the information. They won't do the research for you like NPRC will. They won't send it to you, but you could hire a researcher to go and do that for you. So you would just use the name of that file collection. You would use the information that comes out of the AAD, say that it's part of the POW collection, it has the name of the record group right at the top of it, and submit your request. In this particular case, I was requesting court-martial records. So Sam Addison was court-martialed not once, but twice during his service time. So I had requested, I had found him in the index in College Park, came to the NPRC, submitted the request to view those records in person. And again, it's like these records hadn't been touched. Oh, my image is missing. I apologize for that. I do have an image. Hopefully it's after the burial case files about his testimony about why he kept going AWOL. So I think it's after burial case files. But this is what that form looks like. So if I'm looking for burial case files, if I'm looking for IDPFs, if I'm looking for court-martial records, this is the reference slip that I would submit. Again, name, email address, phone number. If you have your researcher card already, you'd put that number on there and what you're looking for. In this case, Sam Addison, if I had his service number and place of birth, I could have added it to that record. What I'm looking for, that it's out of the Army court-martial case files, that it's record group 153, right? If it's burial case files, I would put series description, burial case files, World War I, or individual deceased persons records, files, World War II, and they would know which collection to search. So burial case files have less information in them than the IDPF records do for World War II. So burial case files just represent World War I, and it's what happens to the soldier or sailor after they've died. So IDPF talks about what killed them, right? Like what caused their death. Burial case files, they've already passed away. This is kind of the aftermath. So typically these records are going to include any correspondence with the family. So if the family writes asking about insurance or bonuses or final payments or anything like that, those records are in there. It's going to include information about the body and their internment. So are they interred in a temporary grave before they're moved either to a permanent location or before they are disinterred and brought home? But it doesn't talk about how they died at all. So most of these records say the same thing. There's a 2-sheet document, has a picture of dental records, right? And they would mark, how are they identifying this person? They're identifying them by their dental records and by their dog tags if they're available. Most of the time it'll say something like bodies too decomposed, identified the soldier or the sailor based on dental records and dog tag or, some other identifying feature. They couldn't do it based on their appearance. In the First World War, 80% of those who were killed during the war, so over 91,000, actually, I think the number is 131,000, were, killed or died of the flu during the First World War. 80% of those were returned. Only 20% of those remained overseas and are interred overseas in an American cemetery. So, the burial case file is going to detail all of that information about where their temporary grave was, and then if they were repatriated, what ship were they on, what train did they bring the body on, what cemetery was it going to. And in burial case files, a soldier had to accompany those remains until they reached their final destination. So it'll be the itinerary of the soldier who has to accompany the casket back. So it'll include their name, their unit and serial number. It'll include their train schedule. What time did they board the train? What time did they arrive at their destination? What time did they turn around and get back on a train to go back to their base? All of that is spelled out in these records. If their family, their wife or their mother were part of the women's pilgrimage, if they were part of the mothers and widows pilgrimage in the 1930s, those records are included in here as well. So if, son dies, mom gets a letter asking her if she wants to go overseas to see her son who remained interred in an American cemetery. Everything about her trip is included in there as well. There's a photo of her. There's a detailed itinerary of every hotel, every stop that she made, on that pilgrimage. And when she returns home, every detail of that trip is spelled out in those records. So there's a lot of really good information in those if you're lucky enough that somebody remained overseas, was interred overseas, and a family member took that journey to visit their grave location. Here's an example. This is a transportation card for the remains of John Kelly. His body was repatriated or was returned home from where he died. So on this card, I can see the name of the soldiers. I can see who the next of kin is. I can say, what ship were they on board, right? They were returned on board the Cantini, in 1921. So their body had remained overseas, interred in a temporary cemetery until 1921 when it was returned. So it tells me that it was returned to Boston Station. There's the times that the gentleman boarded the train. So Private Arthur Glass was the one that had to bring Private Kelly's body back to Boston. And again, it tells me, his company, right? He's in the 22nd Infantry. So there's a lot of information about that process as well. So you can see when Arthur Glass boards the train in New York, when they arrive in Boston, when he turns around and returns to New York. The War Department, that correspondence I was talking about between the family. So this is one for John Schwackhammer. He was the only Plainfield soldier actually killed in action during World War I. We had two that died of the flu. He was the only one actually killed by wounds. And here's a letter written to the family where the family put all of his brothers and sisters in it. So it tells me his mom and his dad's name, tells me his dad is deceased, but then gives me the names of his siblings as well. This is fabulous and phenomenal information. Here's another one for Everett Cooper, right? Again, explain to me the dispositions of the remains. And they almost all say the same thing, that they're identified by their dental records and their dog tags. Here's an example of Everett's as well. So they're telling me here's where he had cavities or here's where he's missing teeth. Tells me that he was originally interred in a temporary cemetery, but then his body was moved to the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery, and it gives me his final resting place. So it tells me the grave, the lot, and the section that he is in. And how do they know it's him? By his dental records and his dog tags. So you'll see these over and over and over. Sometimes bodies are moved 5 times, and there's one of these sheets for each time that body is moved. Here's another one. This is for Robert Monk. Here are the letters back and forth corresponding between the family. One of his family members is writing a letter asking, please tell me, how my family member died, right? So he's saying, I understand that he was killed October 31st, 1918. They would like to have his body brought back, but then decided, no, we really would prefer for his body to remain interred overseas. So that is exactly where he's buried. He's buried at the American Cemetery in Flanders Field. And here's the paperwork on the right-hand side showing that he's interred there, and here's his location, grave 12, plot 16, row A, in the Flanders Field Cemetery. So like I mentioned, those mothers and widows had the opportunity to go overseas. And if they took the government up and accepted their trip, all of those papers are included within their files. There are some records collections in the National Archives website. So if you have the serviceman's name in his service number, there's a master index to women who participated in the Mothers and Widows Pilgrimage. And the wives and the mothers will pop up under that service member's service number. So you can kind of get a feel for whether or not your family is going to show up in these records that are in St. Louis by finding them in that index. That's available online through the National Archives website. But if they did, here are the kinds of things you're going to find. So here's a picture of Mrs. Carrie Ross, right? She took part in the Mother Pilgrimage. Her son, Carl Ross from California, was killed and is interred at the American Cemetery in Flanders Field. And it's a rather robust file, right? Listing every hotel that she visited, how long she was there, what dates was she on the pilgrimage, right? So it's a nice file that includes a lot of information. And look at how sweet she looks. Here's another one. So Mrs. Rose Hashik went overseas. Her son Joseph was killed in action, but his body was not recovered. So he is on the wall of the missing at Flanders Field. But you could see it did include a photo of her, but also her fingerprints, where she's living. Because she had claimed a pension under Joseph's military service, she had another, what's called an XC file, which is my goodness, menopause, an extended service file. So it was a pension file. That's the word I'm looking for. And that's at the National Archives in St. Louis, but it's a different records request. So if you come across something that implies that somebody received a pension in his name, then you would fill out another one of those forms that I showed you and just say that you're looking for the XC pension file. How do you know? If you've been in Family Search, or if you've been in Ancestry or in the National Archives, and you have used those military service records index cards, those files that are digitized on Family Search, it'll have their service number and it'll say XC. And if it says XC and it's before they had applied for it before 1931, then you can request those records from the National Archives in St. Louis. They're not always available, so it's worth trying to see if you can get a copy. Because there is an XC file for Rose, Joseph Hashik's mother, there are all kinds of information because she moved a lot. It seemed like almost every year she was moving to a different apartment. And in order to remain active and still receive her son's pension, she had to file a card every year saying what her current address was. So you could see, all of these different addresses that she lived during her lifetime, 1921, 1923, 1925. Every one of these is a different address. And then when they asked her if she wanted to take part in the Mother's Pilgrimage, she replied back, "No, I'm sorry. I'm just too weak and in ill health. My body can't handle the journey overseas." So she declined going over as part of the widow's pension or the widow's march, the widow's pilgrimage. So IDPFs, pardon the pun, have a little bit more meat on the bone when it comes to cause of death. So these are World War II, and these particular records will include the details surrounding the death. So if they were killed in action, if they died by shrapnel, if they died because the destroyer that they were on sank, all of that information would be included in the file. It would include the condition of the body at the time of death, the cause of death. It would include the disposition of the body after, just like burial case files. How are they being identified? Are they being interred overseas in an American cemetery, or are the remains being returned home? Again, that same correspondence back and forth between the family. So if they were due pension, if they were due bonuses or last payment vouchers, all of that information is in that file. So here's a file. This is for Earl Rockenbach. He was from Plainfield and he sank on the USS Indianapolis. Some of you are probably very familiar with the USS Indianapolis. It was a truly horrifying experience for those survivors. Only about a quarter to a third of the sailors that went into the water survived the 3 days before they were recovered. Very famous monologue in Jaws, who is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. But Earl Rockenbach was on board the USS Indianapolis at the time that it sank. He was listed as missing in action for about 6 months until they declared him deceased. There's lots of correspondence back and forth between the family and the government. So at first it was those letters telling the family that he was missing in action and then eventually declared dead. And then conversations back and forth between his father and the military about his insurance policies and his payment vouchers. Lots of information. Tells me everything about his service, right? So it tells me when he enlisted, where he did basic training, what ships was he on board, when did he last take leave, his promotions. So at the time of his death, he was a ship's cook. So he probably never left the ship. He probably never made it out of the galley because it was 3 levels below the water level. So he probably drowned at the time that the ship was struck. But all of that information is included in his file. Also included in his file is a really interesting letter from his father, asking the government whether or not he was due any money because apparently Earl had a fiancée who, when she heard of him being missing in action, emptied out his bank account and left town and left the family with no money. No idea because they don't name her. I have no idea who she is. But yeah, the dad spilled all the dirty laundry in his request to the government for additional money. So, our court-martial case records. So court-martial records, again, are going to include the charges. They're going to include any testimony from the accused or from witnesses. It's going to include the charge sheet and what the essential verdict is. So the special orders, what happens to the soldier once the verdict is delivered. So here's our Sam Addison. So Sam Addison was arrested and charged with AWOL twice in 1915 and in 1917. And this is the testimony that you can see on the left-hand side when they kind of, you know, put Sam on the stand and asked him, why do you keep going AWOL? And he says, well, just because I miss my family. And then they interviewed, they received testimony from his dad, and his dad says, he's a boy who loves his home a great deal and likes to be at home. Yes, sir, he's very fond of his home. His dad was the one that had to encourage him, like put him in the car and drive him back to the military base, because Sam didn't understand why he couldn't just come home and visit his family when he was lonely. Eventually, he was dishonorably discharged the second time in 1917. But you read the file and you could tell that they kind of felt sorry for him, that he didn't quite understand, like he wasn't capable of understanding what he was doing wrong, and he was eventually discharged. So the first time he served 30 days in the brig, was told you can't do this again, and the second time he did it, he was just discharged, dishonorably discharged. And those records are in St. Louis. So here's the example. Here's 1917, right? It tells me, that, the plea is not guilty. And then eventually it tells me that, he's convicted and, dishonorably discharged. So I'll let you kind of take a look at that for just a second. But it tells you, that he was absent from November 20th until December 5th, 1916, and was found guilty except the words did desert and in desertion. So it's kind of interesting to read these cases. I tried to request the court-martial for Jackie Robinson for the altercation that he had on the bus, and unfortunately they couldn't find those records. So let's talk about those microfilm. You do not need an appointment in order to access these microfilm records. And now you could just access them online directly through the National Archives catalog. But what the morning reports are is, once a month they would detail everybody who's in the unit, how much supplies they have, how many people are absent, how many are in the hospital, how many are on furlough, how many new men have been transferred into the unit, right? So they're kind of, think of Radar O'Reilly, right? He was the one responsible as company clerk for keeping track of all of these records. Those are the types of things you're going to find in these morning reports. So they're only as good as the company clerk. So sometimes they'll tell you, 3 men were killed, and they'll tell you exactly who they are. Sometimes they'll just say 3 men were killed and you have absolutely no idea. Or they'll say 6 men are in the hospital with the flu, but they don't tell you who those 6 men are. So it just depends on who the clerk was for that particular unit. So sometimes you can search these morning reports through the National Archives catalog, and you could put in Smith and the service number and nothing comes up. And it's probably because they just listed 3 men were transferred or 4 men were killed and hadn't been specific enough. But it's still worth pulling in, searching for them, because you can look at the unit records. And if Dad was in the hospital for a month because he had, caught German measles at, Fort Dodge or Fort Riley, right? And you're looking at those morning reports for his unit. It says 17 guys are in the hospital for German measles. Dad's going to be one of those guys. So if you don't see them by name, it's still worth it to look through these unit records just to see if you can still find information about them. But again, it's going to include all of that information about troop movements. It might say something like, we marched 5 miles today. Our stopping point was, and they're going to give you geolocations, and then you can look those up. Here's a couple of examples. This is the 45th Coastal Artillery Corps. And again, like I said, it's going to be, what is their strength, right? How many are sick? How many are on furlough? How many are missing? All of that information. And then what type of supplies they have. And you can see down at the bottom here, it says Privates Hensley and Hayden, are on leave. Private Kirk is AWOL. And then another one says furlough. So like in this particular case, they were giving specific soldiers' names. They don't always do that. And then it tells you their rations, like how well supplied are they for the month. Muster rolls and monthly reports, same kind of thing. So everybody who's in the unit, right? So they're going to give you name, rank, and serial number, and they're going to do that each month. And it's going to break down officers first and then enlisted men second. I'm going to show you an example of what these look like. So if you're trying to, be certain that somebody was in a particular unit at a particular time, these are the records that are going to do it. So here's an example. This is the 313th Engineers. This is while they are at Camp Grant. So this unit is mustered in September 4th, 1917, and this is the very first monthly muster roll that they're doing for that unit. And then again, here are our officers, here are our enlisted men. And what I love about the officers is it tells me where they were before they were brought to Camp Grant. So in this particular case for Edward Blair, it tells me that he's commissioned as a captain in the Engineers, June of 1917. So 2 months earlier, he was given his commission as a captain. Tells me where he was in the interim before coming to Camp Grant. And you can see Robert Fitzgerald's is much more detailed. Even though he was commissioned also in June of 1917, tells us he was in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It tells us he was a couple different places before being sent to Camp Grant. Unfortunately, for the enlisted men, all we're getting is basically name, rank, and serial number. So it's telling me, that Harry Cargo was enlisted October 5th. It's telling me, that Harry Brown is enlisted October 5th, right? How were they assigned that unit? They joined by assignment. So they arrived at Camp Grant and they were assigned that particular unit. And these are reported every single month. Here's another example. Here's another muster roll. This is after the First World War. This is 1924. But here they're telling us all the losses during that month. So it's telling me the following named officers were transferred out of that particular unit. So it tells me, they were either deserted, transferred, or died. So you could see that in this record on the left-hand side. And same thing for the CAC roster. This is after the war. Also, this is 1923. Here are all of the men who are in this unit as of June 14th, 1923. And again, it gives me their names and their serial numbers. So if I'm unsure, if I don't have a serial number for my relative in order to request a file, I can just go through and search by name and see what I can come across. So monthly sick reports, same thing. Are you in the hospital with the flu, the German measles? Did you suffer a shrapnel wound, right? Were you sick in some other way? Then you would be listed in the hospital records. So you can see these particular people are listed here. It tells you, were they on duty? What hospital are they stationed in? What their ranks are, what their serial numbers are. And those are all online now. So you can find these. They're in Fold 3, so you can find some of them in Fold 3 by unit. It's faster and easier to search the National Archives catalog. If you don't find them in the National Archives catalog, then I might check Fold 3, but you should be able to find them through the Archives catalog first and foremost. And just the last thing to keep in mind is the National Archives in St. Louis has not a huge library, but they've got, several bookcases full of useful military books accessible for you to view. They've got a full run of what they call their organizational directories. So it's going to list every branch of service and every division and unit within that branch of service. So if it's the Army, it's going to list, the 1st Army through the 10th Army or the 15th Army, right? It's going to list all of those units. It's going to list all of those divisions, all of those companies. So, it would be something like the 4th Division, right? So in the 4th Division in the Army, we had Illinois infantry companies, 131 through 147, right? So it's going to kind of show you how units are connected within the military. And then the posts, camps, and cantonments books, these were done almost yearly. So if I find I have a record of my ancestor being at Camp Grant or at Kelly Field or at Fort Meade, what does that mean? And it explains where these posts are, what their main responsibilities were, and what units were typically stationed there. And you can look at these almost every year. So if you're looking at World War II records and it says that, you had an ancestor who was at Fort Riley and he was in the 37th Machine Gun Battalion, what does that mean, right? It tells you a little bit of information about those units and what they were doing at Fort Riley. So they can be useful if you're not 100% clear about how the military is organized. These aren't really online yet. I've searched for some of these through HathiTrust. I've searched for some of these through both the National Archives and Internet Archive, and these are not readily accessible yet. So if you're in St. Louis, go through these because you can't find them in another way. So here's an example. So here's Kelly Field. Here's the type, the nature of what Kelly Field is. It was for planes, aviation, and then who would be stationed there, where is it located, and then concentration camp for enlisted men. I would want to investigate that further and find out what they mean by that. That it was a mechanic school, right? So lots of extra detail. And here's that example of that organizational directory. Okay. I know I threw a tremendous amount of information at you. So if you have specific questions or if you want me to clarify something that I talked about, I'm absolutely happy to do that for you. Anne, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you, Tina, for that so far. One person asked, what does CSC number mean on the 13173 form under other identifying information? So this
Oh.
is the yeah, I think that's the works progress form.
Oh, is that if you knew
The
the camp
CSC
service
number,
number?
camp service
Yeah.
number. Okay.
So it could be either because I'm trying to go back and see if I can find the form now. Um, because it's very similar to like a military number, but it would be their individual service number. Did I stop
Oh,
sharing my screen? Let me see if I can click on because I don't have the handout open, so I can't click on the link to find it. But my guess would be that it's the service number. I apologize, I don't have it directly in front of
okay.
me.
Okay. And then let's see, the next question. We're getting more questions. So, they say when I made an in-person request at NARA, NARA, in downtown Washington, D.C. for Civil War
Mhm.
veteran pension application, I sometimes received the following reply. The pension file you requested is not in our custody here at NARA in Washington, D.C. For additional assistance, please write to our office in St. Louis, National Archives, blah, blah, blah. Is there a print or online form I should use when this occurs?
Yes, that's an XC file. So
That's what they say. Is
basically,
there a special form for XC and C
just
folders?
use that slip that I showed you, and you can reach out to the National Archives and ask them for a copy of that form. It's just the reference service slip, and you're going to put the XC number in there. You're going to put the name. You're going to fill out the form. So you're going to put the service person's name. You're going to put their service number if you have it. You're going to put their date of birth, date of death, and then the XC number. The problem with the XC files, especially for Civil War, is that if it was a widow or a child that was getting that pension and they die after 1931, it might not be accessible to you. So you won't know until you try. But yeah, fill out the reference service slip. Don't fill out that OMPF slip where the military information is on the left-hand side. You want to fill out that reference service slip.
Okay. And a second question she has, an ancestor was employed by the U.S. Post Office in Greensburg, Pennsylvania when he died in 1919. Would I
Mhm.
submit a form 13173 for his records?
I'd fill out, yeah, the one with the OMPF where it's civilian on the right and the military on the
The left.
left. But I would check
Okay.
Ancestry first because Ancestry digitized a bunch of their Postmaster records. So I would check that collection first and see what type of information they have on him. And then take that information and use it to fill out the form. So you would be able to look at those records on Ancestry and say, okay, he worked for the government these dates. I was able to corroborate that from the collection on Ancestry. So just kind of glean as much as you can out of that information when you fill out that form.
Okay. Another question, were those last two books you showed, the organizational directory and the Army Post, etc., only for World War One, or are they also books for World War Two?
Oh yeah, they're for World War II. They go up all the way past Vietnam.
Okay. In the beginning part of the presentation, you mentioned Great Lakes in Illinois.
Mhm.
In Illinois, where are those records located?
So it depends on the type of record. So Great Lakes is still an active military base. It is the only naval training base in the U.S. So they do still retain some records in their own archives at Great Lakes. But Great Lakes did turn over some records to the National Archives at Chicago. It used to be called the Great Lakes Regional Archive. Now it's just called National Archives at Chicago. So they would have things, I want to say, and don't quote me on the exact date, but right past the end of the Second World War. So it's either 1947 or 1948. And again, it's just information about running the base itself. So it's none of the naval personnel files, it's none of the unit files. Um, it would strictly be the things like gatehouse entries. So I tried to use them to find out if my grandpa was on furlough at any point. So I went through looking for people coming and going through the gatehouse. Some cool things that they have in there. There was a busload of prisoners, um, U.S. naval sailors who had been arrested and detained for various nefarious acts while they were at Great Lakes, and they were being shipped off, sent someplace else to serve their time. And their bus got caught in a tornado, and everybody escaped because the bus turned over. And all the details of the 3 days that it took them to recapture all of those sailors, those records are at the National Archives in Chicago. They're fascinating.
Oh,
But it's not a lot of like personnel records. So unless somebody worked at the base, maybe they worked in the administrative office or something, you're not going to find a lot of unit records or those kinds of things. But they're still worth taking a look through.
okay. Thank you. Now the reference service slip that you mentioned before, is that something you fill out for in-person only for in-person research?
You could fill it out if you're looking for any of those specialty categories, right? So if you're looking for court martials, burial records, IDPFs, you can fill that form out and they could pull the records. But if you're not going to go in person, they're not going to mail them to you. So you could fill it out, have them ready, and you could hire a researcher to go view those records for you. But you'd fill out the same form.
Okay. What record group are the local World War II Army training camp records under? You said
They're
those
under
records
the
are held
adjutant
in
general's. Yeah, they're under the
regional.
adjutant general's records. For First World War, it's record group 393. I'm not sure if that stayed the same for the Second World War. I don't think the Army, the Adjutant General's records changed. So potentially they would still be under record group 393. But if you do a search, when you're in the National Archives category, you could use the filters off to the left-hand side. So you could filter that down to the decade. So you would just click the decade for 1940 to 1949, and it would show you the records collections that fall within there. And it would give you the record group number. It would give you the series number. It would give you where it's located, whether it's at College Park, whether it's in Washington, D.C. A lot of hospital records. So First World War, Second World War, if somebody served in a hospital unit or was in a hospital, those records are in Kansas City. So, if somebody was, at General Hospital 13, in the AEF, there'd be references to them in the AEF collection in College Park, but the hospital records themselves would be in Kansas City. So, but it'll kind of tell you where those records are located.
Okay. It's totally off topic, she says, but I like the white storage boxes behind you on your left, on behind you.
Oh, these ones?
Yeah, where are they from?
They look like card catalogs. They're not real card catalogs. Actually, it holds all of my paint and ribbon. But they're just from Michael's.
Oh, there you go. No, not that doesn't include records. Um, we
No,
collect
those
other
are down.
things.
Those are
Those
down
are,
behind
yeah,
me.
those look a little less or yeah. Okay, I have a question. So when you go down to St. Louis, how hard is it to find the Personnel Records Center? Is it when you say you want to
It's
drive
right
down
off the
there?
highway.
Okay.
So it's not in downtown St. Louis. It's actually right outside of it. It's in Spanish Lakes, technically Florissant. Um, but it's like I can't remember the highway. It's not 55, but you have to take 55 and then it kind of curves around towards St. Charles, Missouri. I can't remember what highway number that is, but it's
Hmm.
literally right off the exit. So you get off the
Okay.
exit, there's like a roundabout, and then you go straight ahead another half a mile and you turn right into the National Archives
Hmm.
facility. So you visitors parking is to the right-hand side. There's a gate. You don't even have to go through the gate. You just turn right into the visitor parking. You don't have to stop at the gatehouse. And then there's like a fence you walk through, and then it's the only door. You can't go through any other doors. You would walk in, you'd go through the metal detector. They would ask you why you're there. You would say, I'm here to look at records. They would say, okay, to your right. And you just walk straight to your right, and it takes you right to the desk to check in at the NPRC. So
Okay.
it's really easy.
Okay. Any other questions? If you if you do come up with something, I think oh wait. Another one. Are there storage lockers in the facility to house items while visiting?
Yes, because you cannot take like you can't take coats in, you can't take hoodies in. So they give you a key for a storage locker. Like I said, you could take your laptop in, you could take like single sheets in, but like you can't take your purse in or anything like that. So you would put it all in a locker, and it is
Okay.
free.
Okay. If you have other questions, you can reach out to Tina. She does have you have her email on the handout, or you can message me. But I think that's it for tonight. So we've got a lot of ideas for people, so I hope we are all successful. So
Yeah.
thank you for all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Tina, so much. And happy searching, everybody.
Thanks, Anne, and happy Independence Day,
Oh, do you
everybody.
wanted to mention Cagney?
Oh,
Um,
yes. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, for those of you who are still on, has nothing to do with military records. But coming up in a couple of weeks on July 18th, hopefully Nancy is still logged in. CAGNY, which is the Computer Assisted Genealogy Group of Northern Illinois, they do a conference every other year. And this year it's going to be at Harper College on July 18th. Fantastic list of speakers, everything from Revolutionary War ancestors to using AI for your genealogy. Registration is still open. It is going to be open until July 6th. So if you're interested in attending that, I highly recommend it. Fantastic speakers. Suzanne Hoffman, who is the president of the Illinois State Genealogical Society. Um, Marty Axe, who's active in the DuPage, or not DuPage, Downers Grove. Historical Society, Eric Vavra, who's a member of CAGNY, fantastic speakers. I cannot say enough good things. But registration is still open until the 6th. So hopefully you'll come, hang out with me, listen to some fabulous speakers. And then that way you can corner me and ask me all the military questions you'd like.
okay. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good
Bye.
night.